Prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the unknown as we delve into 7 spine-tingling Wendigo encounters that will haunt your dreams. Join us as we explore these terrifying tales, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more bone-chilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.
The sky was an endless gray as Adam, Ella, and Luke trudged deeper into the wild heart of Frost Hollow. Winter had wrapped the forest in a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the crunch of their boots on frozen snow. They had come for adventure, a weekend getaway to test their limits and escape the humdrum of city life. But Frost Hollow had a darker history than any of them knew, and it was about to make itself known. "I still don't understand why we picked this place," Luke muttered, pulling his scarf tighter. His breath hung in clouds in the frigid air. "A cabin in the middle of nowhere, really?" Ella laughed, though her eyes darted nervously between the snow-laden trees. "Come on, it's supposed to be haunted. Don't you love a good ghost story?" Adam rolled his eyes. "Ghosts aren't real. You're just scaring yourself. This is a great chance to get away from everything. A little bit of cold won't kill us." But as the forest loomed dark and silent around them, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just out of sight, waiting for nightfall. The cabin appeared as the light began to fade, barely visible through the heavy snowfall. It was old, its wooden beams gray with age, the windows covered in frost. A single path led up to the door, partially hidden under the fresh snow, as though it hadn't been walked in years. As they made their way inside, Ella spotted something carved into the frame above the door. Strange, crooked letters scratched into the wood, faded with time. She traced her fingers over them, shivering. "What do you think it means?" "It's probably just an old warning," Luke replied, shoving her playfully. "Maybe about bears or something." But Ella couldn't ignore the way the letters seemed to spell out a word. One her grandmother used to tell stories about, in hushed tones, as if speaking it aloud would summon it. Wendigo. They settled in, lighting the old fireplace and cooking a simple meal. The heat was comforting, but it barely pushed back the cold pressing in from outside. The walls of the cabin felt thin, almost flimsy, as if the forest could break through at any moment. "Did you know this forest was sacred to the First Nations?" Ella murmured as they sat by the fire. "They said it was haunted, that there was something out here, hungry for those who lose their way." Adam laughed. "It's just an old tale, Ella. A monster that punishes greed. That's ridiculous." But Luke didn't laugh. He looked out the window, his eyes narrowing at the dark shapes of the trees. "You're both right. It's a story, but it's not just about greed. It's about hunger. The kind that grows when you're lost, when you're alone." Adam, the group leader, a skeptic who thrives on logical thinking. He's determined to prove that nothing supernatural exists. Ella, a believer in the supernatural, drawn to legends and folklore. She has a fascination with the unknown, though she tries to laugh off her own fears. Luke, practical and a little superstitious, Luke is haunted by a childhood memory of getting lost in the woods. He feels the weight of the legends more than the others, sensing something they don't. Each friend brought a different perspective to the trip, but the forest had a way of chipping away at their resolve. Already, the silence had started to weigh on them, filling their thoughts with uneasy whispers. The first night passed quietly, but they woke to find strange, elongated footprints in the snow around the cabin. Deep prints that led in erratic circles before vanishing into the trees. Adam shrugged it off as animal tracks. Probably just an elk or something, but Ella noticed that the prints looked strangely human, albeit with distorted, unnatural proportions. By the second night, the cabin felt colder. The fire seemed unable to keep the chill at bay, and the windows frosted over faster than they could clear them. They heard noises, faint whispers on the wind and distant, hollow howling that set Ella's nerves on edge. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adam brushed it off. "It's the wind, nothing more." But Luke wasn't so sure. "I don't think it's the wind, Adam. There's something wrong here." They tried to ignore the sounds, burying themselves in sleeping bags and turning up their music. But in the dead of night, Ella woke with a start. A shadow loomed outside the cabin window, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. She screamed, but when Adam and Luke woke and looked outside, there was nothing there. "It was real," she whispered, trembling. "I swear it was real." But Adam only shook his head, insisting it was a dream. Still, he couldn't ignore the strange sense of dread that filled the cabin, the feeling that something was slowly tightening its grip around them. The third night was worse. A fierce blizzard hit, howling and rattling the walls of the cabin. The fire sputtered and died, leaving them huddled in darkness, the only light coming from their small, flickering flashlights. As they huddled close, the whispering began again, louder this time, as if coming from all around them. Words they couldn't understand, voices that sounded hollow and distant. Then they heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the cabin. Who is it? Ella's voice shook, but no one answered. A loud bang echoed through the cabin as something scratched at the door, deep gouges that splintered the wood. Then silence. Adam, heart pounding, grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, hoping to scare off whatever was outside. Nothing was there, but when he closed the door, he saw them, claw marks on the inside of the door, deep and freshly made. Luke was shivering uncontrollably, his skin pale and his eyes wide with fear. "It's here," he whispered. "The Wendigo. It's come for us." Adam was about to argue, but then they heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the night, followed by the sound of something scraping against the walls of the cabin. The hunger in the air was palpable, an ancient, insatiable craving that clawed at their minds, making them feel weak, tired, starved. Desperation drove them into the storm, hoping to escape whatever was inside the cabin with them. But the forest was even darker, the trees closing in as if guiding them deeper into the heart of Frost Hollow. They ran blindly through the snow, hearing the heavy footsteps behind them, feeling the creature's eyes on their backs. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps grew closer, the whispers louder, filling their minds with chilling thoughts of starvation and endless hunger. Finally, they stopped, breathless and frozen, only to find themselves in a clearing. And there, in the shadows, stood the Wendigo. It was monstrous, tall and skeletal, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones, its hollow eyes fixed on them with a ravenous stare. Antlers jutted from its skull, and its mouth was a twisted grin, filled with jagged teeth. "Don't look at it!" Luke screamed, but it was too late. Ella was frozen, her gaze locked with the creature's, unable to look away. The Wendigo moved slowly, its body creaking as it approached. The air grew colder, the hunger pressing down on them like a weight, as if the creature's presence alone was enough to drain the life from them. Adam tried to pull Ella away, but the creature's gaze held her. She began to shake, her eyes glazing over as if she were falling into a trance. The Wendigo let out an inhuman screech, recoiling from the light. Luke took the chance, pulling Ella and Adam back, stumbling through the trees, desperate to put distance between them and the horror that had nearly consumed them. They staggered back to the cabin, bruised and exhausted. The Wendigo was nowhere to be seen, but its presence lingered, a suffocating dread that filled the air. They didn't sleep that night, huddling together as the storm finally began to let up. When dawn broke, they gathered their things and left without a word, leaving the haunted woods of Frost Hollow behind. But as they drove away, Ella glanced back at the forest, her eyes wide and haunted. In the distance, just at the edge of the trees, she saw it. A figure, tall and skeletal, watching them with hollow eyes, a reminder that the hunger of Frost Hollow was never truly gone. It was only waiting. The town of Pine Ridge was nestled between dense forests and frozen lakes, surrounded by legends as old as the land itself. Stories of strange disappearances and eerie sightings were whispered around campfires, passed down through generations. But no tale was as chilling as that of the Wendigo, a creature of hunger and madness, born in the darkest corners of the human soul. Clara, a young journalist from the city, had heard these stories all her life. She had grown up in Pine Ridge, but left as soon as she could, eager to escape the small-town superstition and find a life of logic and reason. Now, 10 years later, she was back, reluctantly investigating a series of recent disappearances that had left the town in a state of silent terror. Everyone in town seemed to know someone who had vanished without a trace in the past few weeks. Most of the locals whispered about the Wendigo, blaming the creature for the disappearances. Clara thought it was ridiculous, until she saw something lurking in the woods herself. Clara parked her car at the edge of the forest, wrapping her coat tighter around her as the wind bit into her skin. The winter had arrived early this year, and the forest seemed to breathe in cold, ghostly mists, thick enough to make the pine trees appear like shadowy figures looming in the distance. She looked over her notes, recounting the details of the recent disappearances. 5 people had gone missing in a matter of weeks. Most were hunters or hikers, people familiar with the forest, which made their vanishing all the more mysterious. As she walked further into the woods, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The trees stood tall and silent, casting long shadows over the snow. She stopped, glancing around. Her breath fogged in the cold air, but no one was there. Only silence and the whisper of the wind through the branches. Clara had come prepared with her camera and a voice recorder. She was determined to find logical explanations for the disappearances. Perhaps an animal, or some natural hazard hidden beneath the snow. Yet, the further she went, the more the forest seemed to press in on her, like it was alive, waiting. Clara, a determined and skeptical journalist with a knack for exposing the truth. Logical to a fault, Clara isn't one to believe in the supernatural. Joe, a local park ranger who knows the forest better than anyone. He's seen strange things in the woods but keeps quiet, wary of sharing what he can't explain. Maggie, Clara's childhood friend, a local who stayed in Pine Ridge all her life. Superstitious and fearful, Maggie warns Clara against going too deep into the woods. Clara had met up with Joe earlier in the day. He'd been reluctant to talk at first, his eyes darting nervously around as if the forest could hear him. "There's something wrong out there," he had murmured, barely audible. "People think I'm crazy, but I've seen things, Clara. Shadows that move, whispers when there's no one around. I don't know what it is, but it's hungry." Maggie, too, had warned her. "The Wendigo is real, Clara. My grandpa used to tell me stories. It feeds on those lost in the woods. It can sense when someone's vulnerable, when they're afraid. It's waiting." Clara had laughed it off, but now, with the cold settling into her bones, the warnings echoed in her mind. As Clara ventured deeper, the day began to fade, and shadows stretched across the snow-covered ground. She noticed a strange silence, as though the forest itself had gone still. There were no birds, no rustling of animals, only the sound of her own breathing and the soft crunch of her footsteps. Suddenly, a foul smell filled the air, a sickly, rotting stench that made her gag. She pulled her scarf over her nose and continued, curiosity overpowering her revulsion. She followed the smell and soon stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. The remains of a campfire, with a pile of discarded belongings strewn about, jackets, a backpack, a boot. These items matched the descriptions of the missing people. Clara's pulse quickened as she photographed the scene, her breath coming in shaky gasps. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had simply lost their way, huddled here for warmth and wandered off. Then she heard it, a low, mournful wail that rose from the depths of the forest. It wasn't the sound of any animal she knew, and it filled her with a primal fear that made her want to run. The wail grew louder, then faded into a whisper, carrying words she couldn't understand. Clara's hands trembled as she turned her recorder on, hoping to capture something tangible, something she could analyze later. But when she played it back, there was nothing, only silence. As she continued, the trees grew closer together, twisted and dark, like skeletal hands reaching out to pull her in. The snow was deeper here, untouched and pristine, save for a single trail of footprints. They were large, inhuman, like elongated human feet with clawed toes, leading off into the shadows. Unable to resist, Clara followed the footprints, the forest growing darker with every step. Her logical mind told her to turn back, but something compelled her forward, an insatiable curiosity mingled with a sense of dread. Then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of a clearing, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was stretched tight over sharp bones, giving it a skeletal appearance. Its face was hollow, with sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the dusk, and a mouth that stretched into a twisted, unnatural grin. The Wendigo. It looked at her, and Clara felt as if it were staring straight into her soul, pulling out every fear, every regret, every vulnerable part of her mind. She felt a cold, consuming hunger, one that didn't belong to her, but was somehow filling her thoughts, gnawing at her with an insidious desperation. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, but she managed to stumble back, falling into the snow. The Wendigo moved slowly, its skeletal frame gliding over the ground without disturbing the snow, as if it were floating. It opened its mouth, a low growl reverberating through the clearing, filling her ears with a sound that felt like nails scraping against bone. Clara tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature moved closer, its eyes locking onto hers, and she felt her strength drain away. She felt as though it was feeding on her fear, drawing energy from her terror as it moved closer. In a desperate attempt, Clara fumbled for her flashlight, shining it into the Wendigo's face. The creature recoiled, hissing as the light hit its hollow eyes, and she used the moment to scramble to her feet and run. Clara's lungs burned as she sprinted through the snow, branches whipping at her face as she struggled to stay on her feet. She could hear the creature behind her, its footsteps echoing, faster than she could comprehend, as if it were gliding over the snow. She remembered Joe's words, "It's hungry." The thought spurred her on, her heart pounding in her chest as she pushed through the trees, searching for any sign of escape. But the forest was endless, a maze of shadows and icy branches. Finally, she saw it, the faint glow of her car's headlights in the distance. She was almost there. She forced herself to keep running, even as her legs screamed in protest, even as her vision blurred from the cold. The Wendigo was close now. She could feel its presence behind her, could smell the rotting stench of its breath. But she didn't look back. She focused on her car, the one thing that stood between her and whatever fate awaited her in the depths of the forest. She reached the car, fumbling with her keys, her hands shaking too badly to fit them into the lock. The Wendigo's shadow loomed closer, stretching over the snow, consuming everything in its path. Finally, the key turned, and Clara flung herself into the car, locking the doors just as the creature reached her. It pressed its face against the window, its hollow eyes staring at her with a hunger that chilled her to the bone. She turned the engine on, slamming the car into reverse and speeding away, the creature's twisted face disappearing into the darkness as she drove. Clara didn't stop driving until she reached the edge of Pine Ridge, where she finally pulled over, gasping for breath, her heart racing. She looked down at her hands, still shaking, her mind reeling from what she had seen. No one in town believed her story. They said she'd been out in the cold too long, that the forest had played tricks on her mind. Even Joe was hesitant to admit what he'd seen. But Clara knew the truth. She knew what lurked in the forest, waiting, hungry for the fear and despair of those who wandered too far. The disappearances never stopped. People still went missing from time to time, their belongings found scattered in the woods, with no trace of where they'd gone. And Clara? She never set foot in Pine Ridge again. But sometimes in her dreams she saw it, the hollow-eyed creature standing at the edge of the trees waiting, and she knew that. Chapter 1. The Call to Return. The day began like most winter mornings in northern Minnesota. Icy winds whispering through frost-laden trees, the air crisp with a sense of isolation. Ethan McAllister hadn't planned on ever returning to the Pine Creek Reservation. For years, he'd left behind the dense forests, the gravel roads that led nowhere, and the haunting memories of his childhood. Yet, the call from his sister, Lena, had been impossible to ignore. "You need to come home," she'd said, her voice taut with unease. "People are disappearing again." Ethan had tried to dismiss it as an overreaction. But when she mentioned Uncle Charlie, the elder who'd practically raised them, he packed his truck and made the 6-hour drive north without hesitation. When he arrived, the familiar dread of the forest wrapped around him. Pine Creek hadn't changed much. Small homes nestled in the woods, snow clinging stubbornly to the branches above, and an air of superstition that never seemed to wane. Lena greeted him at the door, her face pale and drawn. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered. "I didn't have much of a choice," Ethan replied. Chapter 2. The Story's Return. The first night back, they sat around the fire in Lena's small cabin, the flames casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan listened as she explained the disappearances. "It started last month," she said. "First, a hunter went missing, then another. And 2 weeks ago, Uncle Charlie never came back from his trap lines." The mention of their uncle sent a chill through Ethan. "You think it's—" Lena didn't need him to finish the question. "The elders think it's a Wendigo." Ethan leaned back, his skepticism clashing with a deep-seated fear. He remembered the stories told by their grandmother, tales of an insatiable creature born of hunger and winter, stalking the woods for its next victim. As a child, he'd shivered at the thought. As an adult, he dismissed it as myth. "Lena," he began, "these are just old stories. There's a logical explanation." "No," she interrupted sharply. "You weren't here when it happened before." Ethan frowned. "Before?" She nodded, her voice trembling. "When we were kids. Remember Mr. Clearwater?" He did. The old man had vanished one winter, leaving behind only his bloodied coat. The elders had whispered about the Wendigo then too, but Ethan had always assumed it was just a way to keep children from wandering into the woods. "This isn't just a story, Ethan," Lena said, her eyes pleading. "You have to believe me." Chapter 3. Into the Forest. The next day, Ethan decided to search the trap lines where Uncle Charlie had disappeared. Despite Lena's protests, he insisted. "If I can find something, anything, it'll help," he reasoned. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he trekked into the dense forest. The trees stood like sentinels, their bare branches reaching skyward. The deeper he went, the quieter it became, the wind muffled by the snow. Hours passed without a trace. But just as he was about to turn back, he noticed something, a small clearing ahead. In its center stood a circle of stones, blackened by fire. The air around it felt heavier, colder. As Ethan stepped closer, he saw claw marks etched into one of the stones. A low groan echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down his spine. He froze, straining to listen. For a moment, all was silent. Then, a shadow darted between the trees. "Uncle Charlie?" he called, his voice shaky. No answer. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 4, The Warning. Ethan hurried back to Lena's cabin, his pulse racing. "You went to the clearing, didn't you?" Lena asked when he returned. "How did you?" She cut him off. "The elders talk about it. They say it's where the Wendigo feeds. If you found it, it's already watching you." Ethan shook his head. "This is insane, Lena. It's just an old fire pit." But her fear was contagious. That night, he dreamt of shadowy figures stalking him through the woods, their eyes glowing like embers. When he awoke, he found Lena standing by the window, staring into the dark. "It's close," she whispered. Chapter 5, The Wendigo's Hunger. The next evening, Ethan decided to confront the elders. He found them gathered at the community center, their faces lined with age and worry. "You brought it back," one of them said when he entered. Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" "By going to the clearing," another replied, "you've stirred it. The Wendigo is bound to its hunger. It smells yours now." "My hunger?" Ethan scoffed. The oldest of the group, a woman named Ani, stepped forward. Her voice was like gravel. "The Wendigo is not just a creature. It is a curse. It feeds on desperation, on the dark places in your heart. The more you deny it, the stronger it becomes." Ethan felt a flicker of doubt. The weight of his childhood fears pressed on him. "What do I do?" he asked finally. Ani handed him a pouch of herbs. "Burn this at the edge of the clearing, and do not let it speak to you, no matter what." Chapter 6, The Final Stand. Ethan waited until dawn before venturing back into the forest. The pouch of herbs hung heavy in his pocket as he retraced his steps. The clearing was eerily silent when he arrived. The circle of stones looked darker, the claw marks deeper. He crouched, pulling the pouch from his pocket and scattering the herbs around the perimeter. As he lit a match, a voice called out from the trees. "Ethan!" He froze. "Uncle Charlie?" he whispered, turning toward the sound. A figure emerged from the shadows. It wore Uncle Charlie's face, but its eyes burned with a hollow, unnatural light. "Ethan!" it said again, its voice layered with a growl. "Help me!" He stumbled back, the match slipping from his fingers. "No," he muttered, fumbling for another match. "You're not real." The creature smiled, its teeth sharp as daggers. "You don't believe me? Look closer." Ethan hesitated, the fear rooting him in place. But then he remembered Ani's warning. "Do not let it speak to you." With trembling hands, he struck another match and dropped it onto the herbs. The flames roared to life, a bitter smoke filling the air. The creature screamed, its voice a cacophony of rage and agony. As the fire consumed the clearing, the shadowy figure dissolved into the wind. Chapter 7, The Aftermath. Ethan stumbled back to Lena's cabin, his body and mind exhausted. "You did it," she said when he returned, relief washing over her face. "I don't know," he replied. "I think it's gone." But what?" He shook his head. "I think it'll always be out there, waiting." As the days passed, the forest seemed to return to its natural stillness. The disappearances stopped, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him. The Wendigo had whispered to him that day, and though he'd burned the herbs, its voice lingered in the back of his mind, a reminder of the darkness that lurked, both in the forest and within himself. Chapter 1, A Frozen Invitation. Hannah Parker had never been a fan of winter. As a wildlife biologist, her work often brought her to remote locations, but the frozen wilderness of northern Alberta was something else entirely. When the university asked her to join a team studying predator migration in the boreal forest, she hesitated. "It's a unique opportunity," her colleague Mark had said. "They need someone experienced with big predators, wolves, bears. And you're the best." It was the flattery that got her. Now, 2 weeks into the expedition, she was regretting her decision. The team was stationed at a lonely outpost miles from the nearest town. Outside, the snow stretched endlessly under a sky that seemed permanently gray. One evening, as they were reviewing trail camera footage, Mark frowned. "This is weird," he muttered. Hannah leaned over his shoulder. On the screen was a series of photos. First, a pack of wolves moving through the trees. Then, suddenly, they scattered, their heads turning as if something unseen had startled them. The final image showed a blurred figure in the distance, tall, skeletal, and grotesque. "What the hell is that?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "No idea, but it's headed toward our southern station." Chapter 2: The Lone Cabin. The southern station was a small cabin used as a supply drop. Hannah and Mark decided to investigate, bringing along Nathan, another team member. They packed snowmobiles with gear and set off at dawn. The journey took hours. The forest grew denser as they traveled, the trees pressing in like silent witnesses. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the snow. Something was wrong. The door hung ajar, swinging lazily in the wind. "Stay close," Mark whispered, drawing a hunting rifle from the snowmobile. Inside, the cabin was in shambles. Supplies were scattered, claw marks gouged deep into the wooden walls. The stench of decay was overwhelming. Nathan gagged. "What happened here?" Hannah knelt by a dark stain on the floor. It was blood, frozen into the wood. She followed the trail outside, where it disappeared into the trees. "We need to report this," she said, her voice tight. But as they turned to leave, a distant howl froze them in place. It wasn't a wolf. The sound was deeper, more guttural, and filled with an unnatural hunger. Chapter 3: The Legend. Back at the main station, the team debated their next move. Nathan, pale and shaken, wanted to leave immediately. "We're not prepared for this," he insisted. "That thing, whatever it is, it's dangerous." Mark, ever the pragmatist, disagreed. "We're scientists. We document, we observe. We don't run." Hannah stayed silent, her mind replaying the howl. Finally, she spoke. "I think we need to talk to someone who knows this area. The locals might have answers." The next day, they drove to a nearby indigenous village. There, they met an elder named Marie. When they described the creature and the strange howl, her face darkened. "You've seen the Wendigo," she said. Mark scoffed. "You can't be serious." Marie ignored him, focusing on Hannah. "The Wendigo is more than a creature. It's a spirit of hunger and cold. It preys on the weak, the lost, and the desperate. If you've heard its howl, it's already chosen you." Hannah's stomach tightened. "How do we stop it?" Marie handed her a bundle of sage and sweetgrass. "You cannot fight the Wendigo, but you can protect yourselves. Burn this and stay together. Do not let the forest divide you." Chapter 4: The First Night. That night, the team barricaded themselves inside the main station. They burned the herbs as Marie instructed, the pungent smoke filling the room. At first, the forest was silent. Then came the scratching. It started faintly, like branches brushing against the walls. But soon it grew louder, more deliberate. "Something's out there," Nathan whispered, clutching a flashlight. Hannah peered through the frosted window. At the edge of the clearing, she saw it, a gaunt figure with sunken eyes and antlers sprouting from its skull. Its limbs were impossibly long, its breath misting in the cold air. "It's watching us," she said, her voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head, as if listening. Then slowly, it retreated into the trees. Chapter 5: The Divide. By morning, Nathan was gone. His snowmobile tracks led into the forest, vanishing beyond the tree line. "He wouldn't just leave," Hannah said, panic creeping into her voice. Mark checked his rifle. "We have to find him." Hannah hesitated, remembering Marie's warning. But she couldn't abandon Nathan. They followed the tracks for hours, the forest growing darker with each passing mile. Finally, they found the snowmobile, abandoned near a frozen creek. "Nathan!" Mark shouted. The only answer was the wind. As they turned to head back, Hannah saw something glinting in the snow. She picked it up, a small, bloodied pendant Nathan always wore. "We need to leave," she said firmly. But Mark shook his head. "Not without him." Before she could argue, a shriek tore through the trees. It was Nathan's voice, filled with terror. Without thinking, Mark ran toward the sound. "Mark, wait!" Hannah called, but he disappeared into the woods. Chapter 6: The Wendigo's Lair. Hannah chased after him, the snow crunching beneath her boots. She caught up just as he reached a clearing. There they found Nathan, or what was left of him. His body was twisted, his face frozen in a mask of fear. Above him stood the Wendigo, its hollow eyes locking onto them. Mark raised his rifle and fired, the shot echoing through the forest. The creature barely flinched. Instead, it lunged at him with terrifying speed. "Run!" Mark yelled, firing again. Hannah didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted back toward the station, the sounds of struggle fading behind her. When she reached the cabin, she slammed the door shut and collapsed against it. She was alone. Chapter 7. The Last Stand. The Wendigo came for her that night. Hannah sat by the fire, clutching the bundle of sage. She could hear it outside, its claws scraping against the walls, its low growl vibrating through the air. "You cannot hide," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow. "I smell your fear. Your hunger." She closed her eyes, forcing herself to stay calm. "Leave me alone," she muttered, throwing more sage into the flames. The Wendigo laughed, a chilling sound that made her skin crawl. "You cannot escape me. I am the cold. I am the hunger. I am in you." Suddenly, the fire guttered out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The door creaked open, and the Wendigo stepped inside, its eyes glowing like embers. Hannah grabbed a flare gun from her pack and fired. The bright light seared the creature, and it howled in pain, retreating into the night. Chapter 8. Escape. By dawn, the forest was silent. Hannah emerged from the cabin, her breath visible in the frigid air. She didn't stop to gather her things. She climbed onto her snowmobile and sped away, leaving the outpost behind. When she reached the village, Marie was waiting for her. "You survived," the elder said, a note of surprise in her voice. Hannah nodded, her hands trembling. "I think it's gone." Marie shook her head. "The Wendigo is never gone. It will always hunger. But you were strong enough to resist. That is rare." Hannah didn't feel strong. She felt broken. But as she looked back toward the forest, she knew one thing. She would never return. Chapter 1. The Expedition. Dr. Claire Hargrove was a renowned archaeologist, known for her work in uncovering the secrets of ancient civilizations. When she received a grant to lead a winter expedition into the Canadian Rockies to investigate rumors of a lost indigenous village, she couldn't resist. The village, according to local lore, had been abandoned centuries ago under mysterious circumstances. Accompanying her were 3 others. Alex, her research assistant, eager but inexperienced. Sam, a rugged wilderness guide with years of survival training. Dr. Nolan Barrett, an anthropologist who specialized in indigenous folklore, with a skeptical attitude toward Claire's ambitions. The journey was arduous, the snow relentless. On the 3rd day, as they ascended a narrow trail, they found it. The remnants of a village buried in ice, the skeletal frames of longhouses poking through the snow. "Unbelievable," Claire whispered, brushing frost from an ancient totem pole. The carvings were intricate, depicting animals and spirits. But one figure stood out, a tall, emaciated creature with antlers and hollow eyes. "That's a Wendigo," Nolan said, his voice tinged with disdain. "A what?" Alex asked. "A spirit of cannibalism and insatiable hunger," Nolan explained. A cautionary tale. Claire ignored him, her focus on a nearby longhouse. "Let's set up camp," she said. Chapter 2. The Discovery. Inside one of the longhouses, Claire made a chilling discovery. A stone altar stood at the center, surrounded by ancient bones. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, spiraling outward like a map. "Ritualistic?" Alex suggested, running a gloved hand over the carvings. "Possibly," Claire replied. "But why would they build this in the middle of nowhere?" Sam, who'd been standing guard at the entrance, spoke up. "Whatever they were doing, they left in a hurry. Tracks lead out of the village and into the mountains. Left or were chased out." Nolan muttered. As night fell, the team gathered in their tent, the wind howling outside. Claire felt a growing unease. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. At midnight, Alex woke with a start. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" Claire asked, sitting up. "A voice," he said. "It was calling my name." The others dismissed it as a dream. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Chapter 3. The Echoes Begin. The next day, the team split up to explore. Claire and Alex examined the totems, while Sam and Nolan followed the tracks into the mountains. At the totems, Alex froze mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" he asked again. Claire listened. Faintly, carried by the wind, she heard it too, a distant voice whispering Alex's name. "We should head back," she said, unnerved. Meanwhile, Sam and Nolan followed the tracks to a narrow cave entrance. Inside, the air was frigid, the walls coated in frost. Deep within, they found more carvings and a pile of bones. "Animal?" Sam asked. "No," Nolan said grimly. "Human." Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the cave. "Did you hear that?" Sam whispered, raising his flashlight. They turned toward the sound, but saw nothing. Then, from the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes emerged. Chapter 4. The First Loss. Sam and Nolan ran. the creature's footsteps echoing behind them. They barely made it out of the cave, the thing stopping just shy of the entrance. "Did you see that?" Sam gasped. Nolan nodded, pale. "It was a man, or it used to be." By the time they returned to the camp, night had fallen. Claire and Alex were waiting, their faces pale. "We heard voices," Alex blurted. "Voices?" Sam asked. "Calling my name," Alex said. "We saw something," Nolan said, his voice low. "It followed us from the cave." That night, the team took turns keeping watch. But when dawn broke, Alex was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his gear untouched. "We have to find him," Claire said, panic rising. They followed his tracks into the forest. After an hour, they found him, or what was left of him. His body was slumped against a tree, his face frozen in terror. Scratches covered his arms, and his chest was ripped open. "No animal did this," Sam said. Nolan pointed to the snow. Beside Alex's body were footprints, long, narrow, and inhuman. Chapter 5, The Wendigo's Song. With Alex's death, the group's morale crumbled. Nolan insisted they leave immediately, but Claire refused. "We can't leave," she argued. "Not without understanding what's happening." Sam sided with Nolan. "Whatever's out there, we're not equipped to fight it." Reluctantly, Claire agreed to pack up. But as they prepared to leave, the whispers returned. This time, Claire heard her own name. "Claire!" The voice was faint, beckoning. It seemed to come from the altar in the longhouse. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nolan shook his head. "Hear what?" "It's calling me," she said, stepping toward the longhouse. "Claire, don't," Sam warned. But she couldn't stop herself. Inside, the altar seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, as if alive. Suddenly, a shadow loomed behind her. She turned and saw it. The Wendigo, its antlers scraping the ceiling, its eyes burning like coals. Chapter 6, The Truth Revealed. The creature didn't attack. Instead, it spoke. "You called to me," it rasped, its voice like ice cracking. Claire couldn't move, her body paralyzed by fear. "I am hunger. I am winter. I am eternal," it said. "And now so are you." Before she could scream, Sam and Nolan burst in, firing a flare gun. The creature howled, retreating into the shadows. They grabbed Claire and ran, the Wendigo's shrieks echoing behind them. Back at camp, Claire revealed what she'd seen. "It spoke to me," she said, her voice trembling. "It said I called to it." "It's the altar," Nolan said. "Whatever rituals they performed here, it woke the Wendigo. And now it's bound to this place." Chapter 7, The Final Stand. The group decided to destroy the altar, hoping it would sever the creature's connection to the village. They gathered their remaining supplies, fuel, explosives, anything flammable. As they worked, the Wendigo appeared, circling the camp. It didn't attack, but its presence was suffocating. Finally, they lit the fire. The flames roared to life, consuming the longhouse and the altar within. The Wendigo howled, its body writhing as if in pain. It charged at them, but the fire engulfed it, its form dissolving into ash. Chapter 8, The Aftermath. When the flames died, the forest was silent. The oppressive weight in the air was gone. "We did it," Sam said, his voice shaky. But Claire wasn't so sure. She stared at the ashes, remembering the creature's final words. "I am eternal." They left the village, the snow quickly covering their tracks. Years later, Claire would still wake in the middle of the night, hearing faint whispers in the wind. "Claire."
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed the terror, like and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Share your thoughts below. And remember, stay close to the light. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.